In 2002, a country died on paper. Its GDP shrank by 28% in 4 years. More than half its population fell below the poverty line overnight. 7 out of 10 children were classified as poor. 5 presidents cycled through power in less than 2 weeks. The currency collapsed. The banks froze. People went into the streets and banged pots and pans because they had nothing left to lose, and the organization that was supposed to prevent all of this had pulled its funding 11 days before the collapse, because the country had failed to hit a budget deficit target. That organization is still operating today. It has made loans to dozens of countries since. It has issued press releases describing those programs as showing compelling progress. And if your country ever runs out of money, it is the only place on earth with the scale to help you. The IMF says it exists to stabilize economies and reduce poverty. And to understand why so many people consider that the cruelest joke in modern finance, you need to understand exactly how it was built and who built it. The IMF was born in July 1944, in the middle of the Second World War, at a resort hotel in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods to design the rules of the post-war International Monetary Order. That detail is worth sitting with, because those 44 nations were not a representative sample of the world. They were the winning side of the war. The countries that would eventually become the IMF's most frequent borrowers across sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America were largely still colonies at the time, without delegations, without votes, and without a seat at the table where their financial futures were being decided. The institution that emerged from those 3 weeks in New Hampshire was designed to reflect the power of the people who built it. Because the United States was the world's largest economy at the time and the main source of funds for the new institution, the American delegation had the largest influence on the proposals agreed to at Bretton Woods. That influence was baked permanently into the voting structure. Every member country contributes financially to the IMF based on the size of its economy, and that contribution determines its voting power, a system the IMF itself describes as a $1, one-vote arrangement. The United States holds 17.43% of total voting power, and since major policy decisions require an 85% supermajority, Washington effectively holds a unilateral veto over any significant changes to the fund structure, so policies, or charter. The practical consequence of that structure is stark. Each person in the global north effectively holds 9 times the voting power of each person in the global south when population is measured against voting share. Until late 2024, the 46 countries of sub-Saharan Africa, the region that has been among the most intensive consumers of IMF loans for decades, were represented on the executive board by just 2 directors out of 24. A third chair was added only after sustained pressure, and only after 80 years of the original arrangement holding firm. And then there is the arrangement that nobody formally agreed to, but that everybody has honored since 1944. The policy is a long-standing gentleman's agreement under which the IMF managing director is always a European and the World Bank president is always an American. There is no mention of the director's nationality anywhere in the IMF's founding charter. It is not a rule. It has never been voted on. It has simply remained in place for the entire history of both institutions. Every managing director has been European, every World Bank president has been American. So, the institution that will decide whether your country gets a loan, and on what terms, is governed by people who will never need that loan. And the conditions they attach to it reveal exactly whose interests they are protecting. When a country signs an IMF program, it does not receive a loan in exchange for a promise to pay it back. It receives a loan in exchange for a specific list of policy changes drawn from what economists in 1989 named the Washington Consensus, a package of 10 prescriptions that became the standard operating procedure for every crisis country the IMF touched for the next 3 decades. The package has been rebranded several times and softened around the edges, but the core conditions have remained remarkably consistent. Understanding them one by one is the only way to understand why they produce the outcomes they produce. The first condition is fiscal consolidation, meaning the government must cut its spending to reduce its deficit. The IMF argues this restores investor confidence and puts public finances on a sustainable path. What it also does is eliminate the budget for the services that poor families depend on entirely because they cannot buy them privately: rural hospitals, subsidized food programs, public school funding, and infrastructure maintenance. The second condition is currency devaluation, making the local currency worth less against the dollar and other major currencies. The IMF argues this makes the country's exports cheaper and more competitive on world markets. What it also does is make every imported product, medicine, fuel, food, machinery, immediately and sometimes catastrophically more expensive for ordinary people who earn in the local currency. The third condition is an interest rate increase, raising the cost of borrowing to fight inflation and attract foreign capital back into the country. The IMF argues this stabilizes the currency and signals monetary discipline. The consequence for a working-class household is that credit becomes unaffordable. Businesses stop hiring, and the domestic economy contracts precisely when people are already under maximum financial pressure. The fourth condition is privatization, selling state-owned enterprises, utilities, and sometimes hospitals or schools to private buyers. The IMF argues this improves efficiency, reduces state spending, and generates one-off revenue. What it also does is transfer public assets, often built over generations through public investment, to private shareholders at prices set during a crisis when the government has no leverage to negotiate. The fifth condition is trade liberalization, removing tariffs and subsidies that protect domestic industries. The IMF argues this integrates the country into global markets and drives efficiency. What it also does is expose industries that were not yet ready to compete internationally to foreign competition that destroys them, along with the employment they provided. And here is where the playbook reveals its deepest contradiction. The developed countries did not get where they are now through the policies and institutions they recommend to developing countries today. Most of them actively used infant industry protection and export subsidies, practices that are now frowned upon, if not actively banned. It was the United Kingdom and the United States, the supposed homes of free trade policy, that used tariff protection most aggressively during their own periods of industrial development. The United States built its manufacturing base behind tariff walls of 40 to 55%. Germany protected its steel and engineering industries with targeted state subsidies. Britain's entire colonial system was designed to keep its captive markets dependent and uncompetitive. These are not disputed historical facts. They are the economic history of the countries that now sit on the IMF's executive board, prescribing open markets and removed subsidies to the countries that never got the chance to industrialize behind protection. And if you want to know what this actually looks like when it lands on a real country, Argentina has been through this experiment more than almost any nation on Earth. And what happened there is not something you can abstract away with a policy paper. Argentina is not a country that stumbled into a bad relationship with the IMF. It built one over 70 years. Since joining the institution, Argentina has entered into 21 separate financial arrangements with the fund, the most troubled and extensive such relationship in the fund's history. The country became, in the 1990s, what IMF officials proudly called their poster child in Latin America, an economy that had embraced privatization, trade liberalization, and a fixed exchange rate pegging the peso to the US dollar at 1-to-1. The IMF approved, applauded, and continued lending. The peso peg was the load-bearing wall. It kept inflation low and gave Argentines a sense of stability, but it also meant the country could not adjust its own exchange rate when external shocks hit. And in 1998, and they hit simultaneously, the Asian financial crisis, the Russian debt default, and the Brazilian real devaluation all within 12 months. Argentina's exports became uncompetitive overnight, tax revenues fell, the deficit widened, and the IMF's response was exactly what the previous section described: cut spending, raise taxes, maintain the peg, and demonstrate fiscal discipline to restore investor confidence. The government cut retirement benefits. It slashed civil servant salaries by 13%. It froze spending 7 separate times in 4 years. Each round of cuts shrank the economy, which shrank tax revenue, which widened the deficit, which triggered another round of cuts. The spiral was not a failure of execution, it was arithmetic. The crisis intensified in December 2001, when the IMF refused to release a $1.3 billion loan tranche, citing Argentina's failure to reach its fiscal deficit targets, and demanded an additional 10% cut to the federal budget. Within days, the government froze all bank accounts. Ordinary Argentines could no longer access their own savings. Protests erupted across the country. 39 people were killed by police in the resulting unrest. Argentina went through 5 presidents in less than 2 weeks. On December 23rd, the country declared the largest sovereign default in history to that point, on more than $80 billion of debt. By 2002, 53% of Argentines lived below the official poverty line, including 70% of all children, while unemployment stood at 21.5% and real monthly wages had collapsed by 18% in a single year. Then Argentina did the thing the IMF had spent years demanding it avoid. It defaulted. It devalued the peso. It took capital controls. It rejected the conditions. And then it grew. The economy grew at an average of 9% per year for 5 consecutive years after 2003, rates that the IMF had consistently underestimated while simultaneously overestimating growth during every year that Argentina had been following IMF conditions. The people who had fallen into poverty did not all climb back out. The damage to a generation was real, lasting, and unevenly distributed, and the lesson went unlearned. In 2018, with a new government in power and a new currency crisis developing, Argentina returned to the IMF and signed the largest loan in the institution's history at that time, $50 billion. Also, the IMF later acknowledged shortcomings in the design of that program. By 2019, poverty had risen above 35%. The peso had collapsed by over 50% against the dollar. The program had failed by every measure it set for itself, and Argentina owed more to the IMF than any other country on earth. Argentina is the extreme version of this story, but Greece is the version that happened in the middle of a wealthy continent, surrounded by wealthy neighbors, and nobody stopped it. If you are inclined to dismiss Argentina as an outlier, too many programs, too chaotic a political history, too uniquely dysfunctional, Greece removes that option entirely. Greece is a founding member of NATO. It joined the European Union in 1981 and adopted the euro in 2001. When the 2008 global financial crisis exposed the scale of Greek borrowing, the country turned to a rescue package organized jointly by the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF, the institutions collectively known as the Troika. In May 2010, the Troika launched a €110 billion bailout to rescue Greece from sovereign default, conditional on the implementation of austerity measures, structural reforms, and the privatization of government assets. The conditions were the same playbook from the previous section, and applied to a European democracy with functioning institutions, a skilled workforce, and full membership in the world's wealthiest economic bloc. Greece's economy shrank by 25% from the 2010 level. Wages and pensions fell. Unemployment reached 27%. And the medicine did not work in reducing Greece's debt-to-GDP ratio, which climbed from 130% in 2009 to 180% at the end of 2014. The austerity that was supposed to restore solvency made the debt burden larger relative to the economy it was destroying. The mean suicide rate rose 35% between 2010 and 2012. Public hospital funding was slashed by 50% between 2009 and 2015. Maternal and child health services were cut by 73% between 2009 and 2012, and infant mortality increased by approximately 31% in the post-austerity period. Greece's health minister described the process not as surgery, but as butchery. A European country inside the Eurozone, surrounded by wealthy neighbors with the institutional capacity to intervene, and none of it was enough to stop a measurable increase in the rate at which its citizens were dying. Now move across 2 continents and 4 decades, because Ghana's story introduces the dimension that Greece cannot. Ghana has been cycling through IMF programs since 1983. In the early years of its first program, 300,000 public sector workers lost their jobs in a single year, and the workforce of the Ghana Cocoa Board was cut from 100,000 to 10,000. The Cocoa Board reduction is not an incidental statistic. Cocoa is the engine of Ghana's export economy, and the instruction to slash the workforce managing it came from the same institution that had identified cocoa specialization as Ghana's comparative advantage. Cumulatively, between 1982 and today, the Ghanaian cedi has been devalued by approximately 38,000%. That number represents 4 decades of a single recurring prescription, currency devaluation, being applied to a country that never broke out of the cycle of dependency it was supposed to resolve. In 2022, the cycle completed itself again. Food inflation reached 59.7%, the cedi lost more than half its value against the dollar, and Ghana became the worst performing currency in the world by Bloomberg's ranking. The country signed a new $3 billion IMF program in 2023 with the same package of fiscal consolidation, revenue increases, and structural reforms that had accompanied every previous program. The IMF's own published report described Ghana's performance under that program as showing compelling progress. 3 countries, 3 continents, 3 different decades, and the same playbook, the same outcomes, and the same institution approving reports that describe their own programs as showing compelling progress. So either the IMF genuinely does not know that its medicine is making patients sicker, or it knows and is optimizing for something other than their recovery. Across 3 countries and 4 sections, a pattern has emerged that is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence, too documented to explain as incompetence, and too structural to fix with better intentions. So, it is time to close the loop that was opened at the start of this video. The IMF is not a development institution that keeps failing. It is a creditor protection institution that keeps succeeding. Those are not the same thing, and the gap between them is where most of the suffering in this video lives. When a country runs out of foreign currency reserves, the people who stand to lose money are not abstract market forces. They are specific institutions, banks headquartered in New York, Frankfurt, London, and Paris. Pension funds managing retirement savings for workers in wealthy countries, so mutual funds. Holding sovereign bonds as safe assets in diversified portfolios. These are the entities that lent the money in the first place. When a government defaults, they absorb the losses. The IMF's role in a crisis is to prevent that from happening by ensuring the borrowing country keeps making debt payments, even when doing so requires dismantling the public services that its own population depends on to survive. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is a structural observation, and it has been stated plainly by people inside the system. The German government's own economic advisor said publicly in 2011 that the Greek bailouts were, first and foremost, not about the problem countries, but about our own banks, to which hold high amounts of credit there. The IMF and European creditors chose not to allow Greece to default on its obligations to private creditors. Instead, they lent it the money to pay those creditors in full, transferring the debt from the private sector to the official sector and ultimately to European taxpayers. The former president of the Bundesbank described this plainly as a bailout of German and French banks, disguised as a rescue of Greece. Argentina's collapse makes the same point from a different angle. Without the 2001 default, an estimated 50% of Argentinian government revenue would have been spent on interest payments between 2002 and 2004. The IMF was still demanding Argentina avoid defaulting at the very moment the country's economy was disintegrating around that obligation. The institution's own internal audit later acknowledged it had overestimated growth and continued lending far beyond what the evidence supported. The pattern repeats because the fund's structure makes it repeat. The countries with the largest voting shares are the countries whose banks hold the most sovereign debt in the countries most likely to need IMF loans. Their incentive is not the welfare of the borrowing population. Their incentive is the continued payment of the bonds they hold. This section does not argue that borrowing countries bear no responsibility for their own fiscal decisions. Many do. What it argues is that the gap between the IMF's stated mission and its structural incentives is precisely the source of the hatred that gives this video its title. And that gap is not an accident of design. It is the design. But there is one question this video has not answered yet, and it is the most uncomfortable one. Is there any alternative? Or is the IMF, for all of its damage, the least bad option in a world that has not built anything better to replace it? After everything this video has shown, the temptation is to arrive at a clean verdict. The IMF is a tool of wealthy creditor nations. It causes measurable suffering. The same prescriptions that failed in Argentina, Greece, and Ghana are still being issued today, often under new names, and the IMF's own independent evaluation office has documented many of these failures without the fund changing course. All of that is true, and none of it is seriously contested. And yet, when a country exhausts its foreign exchange reserves, it cannot pay for food imports, medicine, or fuel. The shelves empty. Hospitals run out of supplies. The lights go out. At that moment, there is effectively one institution on Earth with the scale, the mandate, and the speed to provide emergency liquidity, and it is the one this entire video has been prosecuting. While countries that rejected IMF programs and recovered typically had something the fund could not take from them: a large enough domestic economy to absorb isolation, commodity exports priced in their favor, or enough political legitimacy to survive the short-term pain of standing alone. Argentina had all three. Most countries in debt crisis have none of them. Chinese emergency rescue loans, which are being positioned as an alternative, carry an average interest rate of approximately 5%, more than double the typical IMF rate, and come with their own opacity and restructuring complications that have left countries like Zambia waiting years for resolution. The alternative is not better. It is different, and the difference matters. But it has not yet produced a model that the world can point to as a sustainable replacement. The honest conclusion is that the IMF is the emergency room of a global financial system that is structurally built to keep poor countries poor. Fixing the IMF without fixing that system is like replacing the surgeon while leaving unchanged the conditions that keep filling the operating table. The institution did not create global inequality. It did not force developing countries into commodity dependency. It did not design the global financial architecture that makes sovereign debt in poorer countries riskier, more expensive, and harder to escape. But it does operate inside that architecture in a way that consistently benefits the people who built it. And that is a choice, not a constraint. The countries currently restructuring their debt through Chinese bilateral agreements rather than IMF programs are running a different experiment. The world's financial system is becoming more multipolar, less institutionalized, and less transparent, and the results of that experiment will define the next chapter of this story. Whether it is a better chapter depends entirely on whether the people who build the next system learn the right lessons from the last one. If this video helped you understand why the most powerful financial institution in the world is also the most hated, consider sharing it with someone who still thinks the IMF is just about economic stability. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money, because in the next video we are going to look at the institution that was supposed to replace the IMF's development function and how it ended up serving the same interests through different paperwork.